I see live.
Yes, we are live. Yeah, I love cheesy '80s metal. Don't judge. Don't judge. Trust me. We'll all be saved in the end. And speaking of being saved, we're attempting to salvage this show and bring us back again because Jason has been diligently working on his material and bringing some new insights into Apocatastasis. Is that how you say it?
Apocatastasis.
Apocatastasis. That wonderful Greek word meaning the reconciliation of all things. You'd think that people would just take the Bible at its word, you know?
Well, it's not usually translated that way, but you know,
Yeah.
they'll call it the restoration of all things.
Restoration.
That's different than reconciliation of all things. See?
Now you're sounding like a Calvinist.
That's just how that works. To be fair, the term does not have reconcile. It doesn't have the Greek word for reconcile in it, so it wouldn't really be right to call it reconciliation of all things. That's what it means, but that's not how it's literally translated.
I'm anything but an expert in Greek, and I have no idea, so I'll defer to you on that.
I'm sure we'll get to that many, many years from now when we finally get to Paul.
Yeah, like 10 years down the road.
Yeah, 10 years or so, because I'm doing Paul last.
Oh, geez. It's funny because Paul is the one that pretty much has the majority of the hell texts, you know, the eternal.
Paul? I don't know that say that Paul has the majority of the hell text. I would say that Jesus has the majority of the hell texts.
Okay.
But Paul has the majority of the text, as C.S. Lewis used to say, that give us what warrant we have for believing that all men shall be saved.
True.
Or so Lewis thought. So he used to say that if all we had were Paul's epistles, then we would be Universalists. But since we've got the Gospels and what Jesus says, then if there is any conflict, and he didn't think there was any conflict, but if there was any conflict, we should go with what Jesus says and not what Paul says. So that's why I've started with what Jesus says. That was long ago, back when we were doing season 1. I said that was so I guess I better quickly recap, not the arguments exactly, but for people who are joining in because you saw the topic and you were like, okay, this is what I want to hear about. The topic is the authority to destroy the soul in hell. So they're like, okay, yeah, so that's where I want to go about. I don't care about those other things or not as much. I want to go here. Well, people do go to different places to start. And so every time I go to a new place in the scriptures, then I basically kind of start over from scratch and just evaluate those places as they come and all the local and immediate contexts and the extended context where there are some referentials back in the Old Testament. We'll be getting to some of that. But I also like to do systematic arguments. And so season 1 was mostly about the major places in the Gospels where Jesus is talking about things that have usually been interpreted to mean that there's some kind of hopeless punishment or fate for at least some sinners. It's either eternal conscious torment of some kind or some kind of annihilation, permanent annihilation out of existence. So I went to these places because when I started looking into universal salvation and I went to those places too. So I was like, well, if universal salvation is true, then why? Well, there's all these quotes from Jesus that obviously mean that it can't be true. And I started looking into them, and so I used the same principles that we use when we're working on Trinitarian theism and saying, okay, if we're not just ruling stuff out to begin with, and we're just looking at what the Bible says and all the context and narrative things that go along with it, historical harmonizations and how to put things together and how to put themes together and stuff like that and how the references work. When we do that and we come up with Trinitarian theism, okay, well, that seems like a good method to work with soteriology. That's the logic of salvation. And so I said, okay, well, I'll do that. I haven't really done that yet, so I'll do that. This was many years ago. And so when I started doing that, I was very slow and careful and meticulous about it. And one of the first things I ran into was, at that time, was Mark 9, 49 and 50, where Jesus explains the purpose of the unquenchable fire in Gehenna. And that really blew my mind. I was like, wait a minute, what? That's in the Bible? It really? He just says it right there, what the purpose is. That's right there. And that's not annihilation or eternal conscious torment at all. That's like universal salvation right there. It's right there. Why haven't people said anything about this? My mind was just blown. So
reptilian conspiracy.
Yeah, it's the reptilian conspiracy. So maybe I don't know. So of course I didn't just look at those two verses and proof text those. I went around looking at everything around them and making notes and doing things. So when the time came to start putting my notes together and doing a systematic argument, I didn't start there. I decided to start the argument with what Jesus says about the purpose of judgment, raising people to judgment as well as to Aeonian life. And that's in the Gospel of John chapter 5. So I started there, and that's in episode 2 of season 1. And then other episodes, I went in that episode, I went through other things in John that were related to that chapter. And then in episode 3, I did the judgment of the sheep and the goats from Matthew 25, and also a bunch of other things prior to that. We discussed that in a lot of detail, including some of the Old Testament citations and references that Jesus was calling back to. And we're going to be returning to some of that material here. Then in the next episode, I did do the main Gehenna blocks. That's in Matthew 18 and Mark 9, and I can't recall exactly. Luke does those scenes, but he doesn't put the Gehenna statements there. He does the other stuff, but he does reference some of the stuff that Mark and Matthew reference, and he puts when he takes that material, he puts it around the rich man and Lazarus. So I covered that too. There are connections between all of these things. And then in the 5th episode of season 1, I did the sin against the Holy Spirit, the unforgivable, or the sin that shall not be forgiven, neither in this age or the age to come, and its context, its literary context, and what the scene is about, and what's going on there.
Guilty of that pretty much.
Yeah, well, yeah. Any sin against God is a sin against the Holy Spirit. So specifically, what is Jesus talking about here? And then in episode 6, I did a summary for the season and kind of condensed everything down into 20-minute blocks. In episode 1, which you'll notice I have skipped, I did that because I really prefer to work from theology to soteriology, from the logic of God to the logic of salvation. And so episode 1 was about a case for Trinitarian theism from philosophy. Because I'm going to be talking about it a lot in the scriptures anyway, but I wanted to point out the coherency of the theology and how it fits together, and why we have some doctrines and not other doctrines, and how these things work together to form a cohesive understanding of basic reality. And I got as far, I mean, that's summarizing about 500 pages of discussion. Yeah, I got up to binitarian theism, which
500 pages in about 50 hours.
Yeah, we summarized 500 pages in about 2.5 hours, and that was a task. So I got up as far as I needed to get to in order to start with John. I got up to the idea that you've got one God Most High, and He's two persons, two distinct persons, the Father and the Son, God self-begetting and God self-begotten. I'm not denying the Holy Spirit. It was just for that purpose, I didn't have to go that far, because Jesus doesn't talk that much about the Holy Spirit in that sense either. And for I was starting in John, Jesus is talking about himself and the Father. So I just wanted to set the philosophical and theological groundwork for why it's important for the Son and the Father to be honoring each other, and to not be giving final dishonor and blasphemy to each other. So then came season 2, and season 2 went back, and it was entirely a prequel to episode 1 of season 1, and entirely a sequel to episode 1, season 1. So I talked about terminology and what all these various terms mean, and how I'm using them, and how other people use them sometimes, or why I'm using them one way and not another. And then
fiction of theology.
Yeah, well, what does theology mean? Well, that's the logic of God. That's the logic of thinking about God. So what does God mean? What do I mean by God? Well, by God I mean this and that. The foundation of all reality, and it's rational and sentient, it's personal, and it's not atheistic. What does that mean? And so forth. And then on the other episodes for season 2, I went further from developing binitarian theism into ethics and Trinitarian theism and sin and judgment and justice and what these various things are involved. And then I worked out from that position, I sort of worked out an expectation as an apologetic leading back to the scriptures. What can we expect God to do in real history about sin? And so I showed from a certain standpoint why I would, even if I didn't know the Bible, if I had just worked myself there by philosophy, I would be looking for a set of stories that worked out things in history that involved God choosing a people like the people of Israel and making a promise like a promise to Abraham and working stuff out on that, and then having something like the incarnation that we find in the New Testament, and the Passion and the Ascension and these other things. Okay. So that was season 2. So now we're back to the scriptures again in season 3. I had to take a long way around because I wanted people to, somebody may have been coming on here like, okay, what's he going to be talking about? Well, this is what I have been talking about. So this lecture is going to be a sequel to the lecture from back in season 1, where I was talking about the sin against the Holy Spirit. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to segue from that into Jesus's last main Gehenna warning. I haven't covered this yet. There was one other major place where Jesus talks about Gehenna. Now, Gehenna is the word that's often translated as hell, and I was okay with that. Still am. I went through about an hour and a half of talking in that episode about how that's fine. That's okay. There's lots of things in the Bible translated as hell, and that is okay. Anything that hellish just means whole. Okay, in Old English, it's the same thing as Sheol. Okay,
the Sheol of the Old Testament. Well,
yeah, it's exactly translating Sheol of the Old Testament. Okay, it translates it better than Hades does, but Hades is conceptually kind of the same because Hades is a noun that sort of, it's like saying the invisible. Okay, so the unseen.
Tartarus, that's the punishment oriented.
Tartarus, yeah, and that's roughly talking about the darkness. Okay, it's taking a description and making a noun version. And there is one place in the New Testament that talks about Tartarus. We're not going to get there for a while because that's in one of the epistles, but they do talk about it.
Oh, let me not draw you astray.
So there is one place that is talked about Gehenna. Gehenna was a valley that went around 3/4 of Jerusalem. The word means Ge is valley or hole in the Old Testament. Ge and Sheol were both synonyms of each other. Ge also had I almost had a really bad pun there. It has relations to the word for woman also, because women have holes. To be honest, it's a poetic figure. So there's but the valley of the sons of lamentation. That's what Gehenna means.
When those things come to my mind.
Yeah. Well, and I can tell you, it came to other religious people's minds too, because there's Gaia. In other pagan,
people don't realize just how pornographic most pagan religions are. I mean,
until you really get down to it, yeah. But then again, that's what the Norse idea of hell was. Also, they considered it a goddess named Hole because she lived in a hole, and she was a woman, so they called her Hell. They called her Hole. So anyway. So, but it's okay. Listen, the term is fine. I know a lot of Universalists have problems with hell. Hell is not in the Bible. That's Gehenna and a bunch of other things. Yeah, it is. It's fine. It's okay. Translating Gehenna as hell is a little short. It should be like the hell of lamentation, but that's fine. You can just call it hell.
We're not those kinds of Universalists.
Yeah, some people are those kinds of Universalists, but I'm not. That's a thing. So, so Jesus talks about Gehenna mostly in that previous episode that I was talking about, where he's warning his own apostles that unless they shape up, they're going to be thrown into Gehenna. And a lot of people don't notice that he's warning his own apostles, including Simon Peter and James and John.
As a small aside, gearing up for tonight, one of the shows that I reviewed was when me and Johnny Ray had a conversation with Sean Hare, and I was struck by his question of, how you define wrath, and my response to that when I interjected. And it's like, I can't believe I never saw this before. The only time you ever really see wrath in the Old Testament is corrective. It's only ever corrective. There's never an ultimate destruction in the Old Testament. That's a concept that's unique to the
Well, they will talk about, in the Old Testament, they'll often say, and God killed them dead, the end, basically. But that's not annihilation, because they're going to come back.
Right. And the whole point of why I bring that up is because the majority of the time, like Ezekiel spent some time talking about the other nations, but most of the doom and gloom prophets are God bitching at Israel saying, I'm going to punish you worse than I've ever punished any nation ever before. And this is God's own special people.
Oh, yeah. And he uses, especially in Ezekiel, he uses descriptions much worse than the kind that you just gave.
Oh, yeah. Ezekiel's like the primary hell spot.
Oh, man. It's harsh.
But
anyway. Yeah, but it's very, and we'll see some of that. I've been talking about some of that already when Jesus refers back to Old Testament things. And by the way, he will usually kind of, he'll say these things happen in the Old Testament, or he'll refer back to them, and at the same time he's saying, and that was me. I'm saying that, I'm doing that, and we're going to be seeing more of that tonight on this thing.
See, and that's the stuff that I like, because I see that, written all over the New Testament, Christ taking credit for being the I am.
Yeah, Jehovah. Yeah, the one and only self-existent God. Mm-hmm. Yep. And you shouldn't be worshiping any lesser Lord or God either. Not anyone else. And he gets torqued if you do. So it's not like a situation of saying, oh, it's okay to worship this super angel or this man over here like he was God. No. No.
Absolutely. We see that in Revelation with John and the angel.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yep. All right. So in the previous episode on the sin against the Holy Spirit, which shall not be forgiven, either in this age nor the age to come, I noted that even though Luke does report the same incident Matthew and Mark are reporting, the healing and exorcism of a man who had already been exorcised before, Luke doesn't report that saying or a version of it during the same incident. He reports the incident, but not the warning about the sin against the Holy Spirit. Instead, Luke reports Jesus warning about the sin against the Holy Spirit in another incident or scene, so to speak, which has connections to this remaining Gehenna material in the Gospels. Oops, there's the office phone going off.
Didn't even hear it on this end.
Okay, good. Just to make things, well, and you may hear the voice here coming through in a second. We'll pause. You can talk. I'm going to mute this, and you can talk for a second.
Not like we're on NBC, but cool. We got the whole backdrop there, so kind of making the ambiance. But I don't even know what to say. I was wrapped up in what you were saying. I don't know where you were going with the whole stuff.
Okay. They hung up. Okay. I was watching the sun. The sun has gone down since I started talking. Watching your behind your window behind you there.
I love this. I call this my crow's nest. Let me move the camera for a second just so you can see this. If you look around, I have a panoramic set of windows here, so I can see pretty much in 3 directions out of my bedroom. This is my solace. I love this bedroom. It's awesome, and it's the perfect place to do the broadcast from.
I love the main scenery behind you there.
Oh, and we're experiencing a lot of revitalization of stuff that was getting run down for a while now. Maine is a pretty happening place. Not to detract from what we're saying. Yeah.
All right. Now I'm going to make things more confusing. Get ready.
Yay.
Luke reports that this primary Gehenna warning incident too, but he leaves out the Gehenna warnings. Or rather, he later alludes to some material directly connected to those Gehenna sayings, but without mentioning Gehenna per se, but with a direct connection by his topical placement to the parable of the rich man in Hades. And now, just to fulfill confusion further, Matthew's parallel report of Jesus' lesser Gehenna warning at Gospel chapter 10, verse 28, which Luke reports at Gospel chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, features nearby details paralleled partially between both authors, but sometimes in different scenes.
And we can't just assume that this is by accident, because
no, that's not by accident.
Of all the authors, Luke was by far the most technical of the writers.
Yeah, but he had a tendency to topically shift stuff around too.
Well, yeah, because he dealt more with a logical flow of thought rather than
he did. Yeah. This is why I chose to work first with other statements from Jesus, because even when I found it important to check extended context between the Gospels and back into the Old Testament, which is the Jewish canonical scripture shared by Christians, whenever I found Jesus or a Gospel author making such a reference, those blocks could largely be considered as blocks, whereas this and future episodes are going to have to deal with sayings of Jesus reported in a more scattered fashion by the various authors. Of course, I could just look narrowly at those particular 3 verses, 2 in Gospel Luke and 1 in Gospel Matt, and totally ignore the surrounding context and their surrounding context where Matthew or Luke report similar material in different places. But so far, I've found proof texting verses and ignoring context to be a bad idea. And besides, my non-universalistic audience would rightly complain if I simply proof text a verse somewhere without even trying to account for the immediate and local contextual details, especially when you might think the context makes a difference in understanding the meaning. So,
if we don't let the Diskies get away with it, they ain't going to let us get away with it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And they shouldn't. That's okay. So, on to the verses at last. Okay. Gospel Matt 10:28, Gospel Luke 12, 4 through 5, are where Jesus talks about the authority to destroy people in Gehenna and how this relates to properly fearing God. Matthew and Luke report some subtle but important differences in the saying, and the setting in each case is different. If only one version of the saying has been reported in its original historical setting, I would argue that the internal evidence suggests it's Luke's version on the road, with Matthew having ported it and some other material from that Lucan incident back into Jesus' discussion about the call of the apostles and Jesus commissioning them as preachers. But Jesus could have easily said it first to the apostles before sending them out on their first evangelical mission, as Matthew reports, and then later to the general public while on the way into Jerusalem from Jericho the week before the final Passover, as Luke reports. There are also, by the way, no significant differences in the transmission of either version of the saying in various subsequent copies of Gospel Matt or Gospel Luke. In Luke's version, Jesus says, I'm translating to English, obviously, "But I am saying to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who can kill the body, yet after this they can do no more. Now I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after killing, has authority to cast you into Gehenna. Certainly, I tell you, be afraid of this one." In Matthew's version, Jesus says, "And do not fear those who kill the body, but haven't the strength to kill the soul, but rather fear the one who is strong to destroy both soul and body in Gehenna." So what does it mean to kill both body and soul in Gehenna? And who is the one who has the authority and power to do so? These are important questions, and I'm going to have to spend a lot of time going through the interpretive options because I think it's important to think carefully and in detail about such things. But since I will be arriving at the traditional conclusion of Jesus talking about God, not about somebody else, punishing people after death, not people suffering natural death in this life by punishment or otherwise, someone in my audience may excusably decide to skip ahead, find the little click mark on the hyperlink below the video and just kind of jump ahead to that. The traditional conclusion that Jesus is talking about God being the one to fear here should be familiar to everybody, whether you agree with it or not. But some people have argued that Satan is the one who has the authority and strength to kill both body and soul in Gehenna. Those people are, however, perhaps accidentally, denying Trinitarian theism, or even a mere supernaturalistic theism, where God as the ultimate judge is certainly the only one with the authority as well as the power to punish sinners both in body and in soul, even if he delegates that authority and empowers other creatures to do so. And in the scriptures, he never delegates that authority or power to anyone else, unless it is to the Messiah in a non-Trinitarian Christology. Satan does receive delegated authority or permission to destroy the body sometimes, the opening chapters of Job, for example, or 1 Corinthians 5:5, but not to destroy the soul or the spirit, or anyway, not in a sense that could be compared and contrasted to destroying the body only. The soul, or suke, is not merely the life of the body in Gosmat's version of the saying. And Gehenna involves something more than bodily death in Gosluke's report of the saying. The people who go this route of Satan being the one we should fear tend to ignore Gosmat's version, whether through inadvertence or maybe they think it's an inaccurate version. Sometimes these people are universalists who are trying to oppose the idea that people should in any way fear God or God's punishment. But sometimes they are non-universalists who are trying to oppose the same thing. You might suppose this idea only crops up in people who are ignorant or unskilled in keeping track of overlapping details between the Gospels, but I could name a highly experienced and respected modern New Testament scholar, one whom I also highly respect, who has tried to go this route without reference to Gosmat's data, and also without much consistency to two of his other unusual positions, that sinners are annihilated by God's authority, not Satan's authority and power, in the final judgment, and that most or nearly all judgment warnings in the Gospels, especially Gehenna warnings like this one, are not about final judgment at all, but are only about the fall of Jerusalem, where the Romans, not God nor Satan, killed only the bodies, not also the souls, and dumped them into the nearby valley of Gehenna. But he recognized that this saying couldn't only refer to the Roman slaughter of Jewish rebels, because that would rather fit the category of whom not to fear. And yet he didn't want to regard God as the one who actively annihilates sinners, waiting with a large stick to beat anyone who steps out of line, as he once put it. So who was left over? In his account, it could only be Satan. This scholar, who I'm not going to name because I don't want to cast aspersion on him, okay? I'm just saying he's around, and if you've been reading around, you'll know who I'm talking about. This scholar was certainly correct that Luke reports Jesus immediately going on to portray Israel's God as the creator and sustainer who can be lovingly trusted in all circumstances, which was part of this scholar's reason for inferring that Jesus must be referring to Satan. But since this scholar believes in a finally hopeless punishment or fate for at least some sinners, in other words, annihilation, and he was just unable to reconcile the idea of Jesus specifically saying we shouldn't fear God, who has only good intentions and caring love toward us, with Jesus warning us about the only one who not only has the metaphysical power and authority to destroy both body and soul in Gehenna, but who is also the only one ever shown to do something like that in the scriptures, namely God. Further against this idea that Jesus meant Satan as the one with the authority to destroy both body and soul in Gehenna, I can add that if Jesus had an Old Testament reference in mind, it was probably Isaiah 8, verses 12 through 13, where Jehovah himself is encouraging people not to fear the coming Assyrian punishment, even though it was going to result in death. But rather, if they're going to fear any authority, they should fear and dread Jehovah, the holy Adonai of armies,
Yes,
who was the one.
Your father comes home. That's what comes to mind to me.
Yeah.
just you wait until God.
Oh yeah, right. Wait until Dad comes home. He had the power to bring you into the world, and he has the power to put you out of it.
He's the one that has the belt.
Yeah, he's the one with the belt. And he's the one who's authoritatively sending the evildoers to destroy both houses of Israel in that prophecy. I can also point to what we now call the fourth chapter of James's epistle, James chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, where James warns those who have let pleasure go to war in their bodies, leading them to murder and envy and otherwise abuse each other, including the figurative murder of judging one another, that one is the lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and to destroy. And who are you, the one who is judging the neighbor? Now, is there any question which one and only lawgiver and judge James intends to mean, who is able to save and to destroy? Could that one and only lawgiver and judge be Satan? No, of course it's not Satan.
James is talking. Lady you were just channeling. Is it Satan?
Is it Satan? No, James is not talking about Satan. He's talking about God, probably with Isaiah 33:22 in mind, where Jehovah is our lawgiver, judge, and king, and where Jehovah is more than prepared to exercise that judgment against evildoers. At any rate, the question of who should be feared has to be answered by who fits the criteria. This one, whoever he is, has the authority and strength to destroy both body and soul in Gehenna. Not only the mere capability of killing the body and then after that being able to do anything more to the person, whatever else he may be able to do to the body. And whoever that is not Satan, much less a Roman emperor like Titus or Vespasian. Nor do the Pharisees, whom Jesus was more explicitly warning not to fear, have any authority, much less the power, to destroy the soul as well as the body, whether in Gehenna or anywhere else. Another theory has been that the one who has authority to destroy the soul as well as the body in Gehenna is sin. But the exousia, or authority cannot be an impersonal power. There are several dozen occurrences of exousia in the New Testament, and not one of them elsewhere refers to impersonal authorities, including a few verses earlier in Gosmat 10, translated by the author or compiler of Gosmat from Jesus' original Aramaic, of course, where Jesus gives exousia to his apostles. Even the powers and authorities against whom St. Paul says Christ and his church fight spiritually in the epistle to the Ephesians are regarded as being in personal rebellion. Related to them being in personal rebellion, Paul also goes so far as to insist they shall be reconciled eventually to Christ, who thus becomes the head of every exousia in that same epistle. I'll be getting to that much, much later. Now, to be fair, the Matt 10 version of this warning does use a more generic term for power, which could be impersonal, unlike exousia in Luke 12's version, and unlike exousia, for example, a little earlier in Matt 10. And the pronouns in either Gospel's report could be translated impersonally, but we would need strong contextual reasons to regard this as the only impersonal usage of authority in the New Testament. So what do those contexts look like? Well, in Gosmat 10, Christ has just finished encouraging the apostles not to fear persecution and death from personal authorities. If those authorities call the master Beelzebul, how much more so shall they call those of his household, etc.? Notably, the Pharisees will do just that later in Gosmat in the incident of the sin against the Holy Spirit, which I grant was certainly a case of their flagrant hypocrisy, which is the sin, hypocrisy, that Luke connects topically, including specific reference to the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, to his own report about this Gehenna saying. Christ follows up in Gosmat 10's report with a warning that he will personally disavow those in front of the Father who disavow him before people. Warnings of personal distress from family persecution are included before the end of that address and that chapter. So the context of Matt 10, before and after verse 28, are repeatedly and strongly warning that those persons who can kill the body are going to do so, but the apostles should keep on going and don't fear them, with at least one warning in this group of sayings of a personal threat from Jesus himself against what amounts in practice to fearing human authorities more than fearing God. Even if Matthew ported the saying of warning and consolation from the Luke 12 address, which is a different scene, back here for topical convenience, he still dropped it into a context of personal threat to the body and encouragement not to fear those people who can only harm the body.
Now, stop me if I'm jumping ahead, but I'm just curious what the phraseology can and can't mean. I'm talking about destroying the soul. Like, what can that mean and what can that not mean? Because of course the annihilationists or conditionalists will jump all over that, saying that, well, clearly that shows support for their position that there can be a cessation of being for.
Oh yeah, we'll be getting to that, and that's important too.
Curious what that destruction entails, but
we'll get to. There's going to be some now. I have been talking in previous episodes about what Jesus means by what the purpose of the fire of Gehenna is and things like that. So systematically we'd be porting that in here. But since I'm only just looking at this at the moment, I'm just trying to go with what this says right now. But I will be looking at some of the context around here, and some of those contexts do not point toward annihilation.
One quick question before we move on. What relationship does this phraseology have to do with the term colossus? Is this found in these passages? Is it related to them?
The term colossus, as far as I know, is not found in this passage, and not a cognate for colossus either. Colossus, for those who don't know, is the Greek term for punishment that's found in Matthew 25, most notably. It's pretty rare in the Bible, with the judgment of the sheep and the goats.
On this topic itself.
Yeah. Now, there are connections in this material to the judgment of the sheep and the goats. Some pretty strong connections, as we will see. This is basically, on Luke's side of this material, he's going to be reporting variations of the parables that are around the parables of the sheep and the goats. But we'll be getting to that. So it is going to be topically connected to where Matthew has Jesus using the Greek word colossus later.
Stay tuned, true believers.
Oh yeah, that's coming up in the episode here. So I'll also grant that Luke, in my harmonization judgment, has a tendency to cluster teaching portions out of chronological order, and that this was most likely part of the teaching on the road during the final approach from Jericho to Jerusalem before Passover, which Luke spreads out as an important source throughout his central portion of his gospel. whereas the dinner with the Pharisees, not much sooner, back in Luke 11, most likely happened much earlier, maybe even more than a year earlier. But Luke has at least put them in close proximity for topical purposes. And while, again, I'll grant that Luke has almost certainly spiced up the dispute with the lawyers and Pharisees at that dinner with sayings from the greater condemnation against the Pharisees at the temple on Tuesday or Wednesday of Holy Week, a scene Matthew reports, but which Luke doesn't otherwise include in his gospel. So this is as good a place as any for Luke to thematically include it. Nevertheless, the point is that Jesus has thrown down hard against the Pharisees recently in the narrative, and so, chapter 11, verse 53, the scribes and the Pharisees are beginning to hem him in dreadfully and to be quizzing him concerning more things, ambushing him, seeking to pounce on something out of his mouth in order to accuse him. And that's a personal persecution with an intent to get the crowd to be in favor of killing him. That's Luke's context of the leaven or sin of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Personal persecution by religious authorities to the death. Therefore, do not be afraid of the ones, that's plural in Luke, not singular, the ones that are killing the body, yet after this do not have anything more excessive they can do. Be afraid of the one, singular, that after killing has authority to be casting into Gehenna.
This is a very fascinating concept, and I don't want to gloss over this, because what I hear you saying is basically Christ's message there was, don't fear the people who tell you about me. Fear me.
Yeah, that's it. That's part of it. Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that, but that's true.
It just seems like it's the addressing the whole intermediary issue.
It can be, yeah.
Now, stepping into his place, and Jesus, of course, not necessarily directly applying this to himself, but God by extension. It's just, don't worry about the people who tell you about things, who try to throw names around and use this authority. Worry about the dude who's actually looking at you, who's actually holding you accountable. Worry about the one who's you're going to have to face on the last day.
Local Lucan context afterward includes a judgment warning, just like in Gossamat, that those who disavow Christ, a personal renunciation of Christ to other persons, shall be disavowed by Christ before the Father, or avowed by Christ for those who faithfully stand up for him against enemy authorities. There's your thing again. Don't be afraid of the ones who are the ones interpreting me. You be afraid of me. This is also where Luke includes his version of the warning about blaspheming the Holy Spirit, which, remember, is why I segued here from that chapter's discussion. What follows and ends this Lucan scene? A warning that the disciples will be persecuted by human authorities, but encouragement that the Holy Spirit will help them defend themselves. So again, in somewhat similar, but also somewhat different ways, including thematic connection to prominent Pharisee hypocrisy scenes in both Gossamat and Gosluke, which Gosluke happens not to report otherwise, the situational context locally before and after Luke chapter 12, verses 4 through 5 involves persecution by personal authorities. For whatever reason, Luke has placed it into a context of personal threat to the body and of encouragement not to fear those people who can only harm the body. I conclude then that the total weight lands heavily on the authority to destroy both body and soul in Gehenna being personal. It's a personal authority. But could the ultimate authority to be feared be a personalization of sin? That question almost answers itself. Obviously, sin isn't any kind of ultimate authority, whether personalized for poetic reasons or not. And whatever rebel authority which sin might be said to have poetically, it shouldn't be one we accept. I don't have a problem in principle with the personalization of sin as a poetic figure, but I see plenty of reason in the surrounding local context of each occurrence of the saying to be comparing personal activities who are actually personal, not mere personifications. The opponents of Christ are all personal, and in their own limited ways, they are personally authoritative in judging those who avow and disavow Christ. Christ and the Father are similarly personal in authoritatively judging those who avow and disavow Christ. The opponents of Christ may have authority and capability to kill the body, but nothing more. The Son and the Father certainly have authority and capability to do more than kill the body, regardless of whether they use that authority or to what extent they use it. I see absolutely no reason from the context to introduce sin as a personalization having only the metaphorical authority to do what two truly personal authorities in the context of both sayings, the Son and the Father, certainly have the real personal authority and power to do in judgment against a person. A judgment which the context of both sayings indisputably mentions, disavowing those who disavow Christ to spare themselves from trial by human authorities. An argument would have to be made from extended context somehow trumping the local surrounding context and or from the theological principle. For example, maybe somebody thinks God has no power or authority to destroy the soul as well as the body, or maybe God doesn't have the authority and power to send a person to Gehenna, whatever that means. But I certainly see no argument from theological principles, since I affirm from a consistent supernaturalistic theism, including Trinitarian theism, that God does have the soul, power, and authority to destroy the soul, pardon my pun, as well as the body in Gehenna, whatever that may mean or otherwise. And I have yet to see any kind of extended context argument, much less a strong one, about how, in comparison with criteria elsewhere, the details of this saying signal a personalization of sin as the authority to be feared. Moreover, whatever Gehenna means, it has to refer to a condition where this person who has authority and power can destroy both the soul and the body, whatever destroy means here. We haven't really talked about that yet. Not only do something more to the body after killing the body, and the soul here cannot mean only the natural life of the body, even though it often does elsewhere in Christian and Jewish texts, including the canonical scriptures. That natural soul is naturally slain every time a natural body is slain, including, for example, when Christ dies on the cross. Satan could have the power and authority to destroy the natural soul, but so would literally anyone or anything else under God. There would be no reason for Jesus to make a distinction between one or another creature, since, at least in theory, all creatures would alike have the capability to destroy the soul in that sense, as well as the body. In this case, then, soul must refer to the spirit, which survives the death of the body and its natural life. Satan does not even have the mere power, much less the authority, to destroy the spiritual soul, so to speak, as well as the body. Much less do Pharisees or Romans have power to destroy the spiritual souls, so Jesus wasn't warning about them either. Not surprisingly, Romans only killed bodies at the fall of Jerusalem, throwing only the bodies into the literal Gehenna, the valley of the sons of lamentation, around Jerusalem. So neither they nor even Satan are the ones who Jesus was warning his followers to fear. Only God Most High, the self-existent Jehovah from whom all spirits come, has the power and the authority to destroy more than only the body, both body and soul. Therefore, Gehenna, although it's a metaphor, represents more than a burning garbage dump, which, after all, can only destroy the body. Proposing anything else with that power and authority, that isn't even supernaturalistic theism anymore. And the scriptures show nothing and no one having anything like that power and authority. On the contrary, the scripture testimony is strongly emphatic and colorful about God being the one to do it, including in the OT references to Gehenna as a punishment, which I won't be getting into for a long time, but none of which seem to be referenced by Jesus, Matthew, or Luke here. So, if even destroying the soul and body in Gehenna is a hopeful punishment, however, everything becomes easy. God is able to save even the lost or destroyed. The terms are exactly the same in biblical Greek, even especially when God is the one who does the destroying. For, as Jesus goes on to say not long afterward in Luke's report, that's Gospel Luke 12, verses 27 28 in context, related to his immediate consolation about the birds back in verses 6 and 7, although mirrored in Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, 25 through 30, and its context, rather than Gospel at 10. If God cares so much about the grass of the field to dress them in greater glory than Solomon, even though the flowers are here today and tomorrow are cast into the fire, how much more does God care for you, you of little faith? God does not regard you, even if you have poor faith, as something only to be thrown away and burned like trash. Nor is Christ speaking obviously here about some special elect whom God values more than flowers, while he values the non-elect not even so much as flowers, giving them souls more than the natural souls, the natural life, which even flowers are given, that by his choice can only do injustice and shall only be annihilated back out of existence or else suffer unending torments.
Now let's dispel all anachronism here and remember the context in which these words were spoken. We're talking about a carpenter who had no power tools. We're talking about a land where common preservatives and medical practices and just hygiene was not practiced. Where in cities, people would throw their human waste out their windows to flow down into the streets, infecting everyone with whatever was going on. This is a world that was vastly more harsh and cruel than the world that us modern day first world know about. And he's saying that God cares about you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we have the audacity to whine in our ivory towers about how cool the world is when we have it a million times better than the very people to whom Christ is speaking in this moment.
And a million times better than people in what we now call the third and fourth worlds, who are in much the same position as to whom Christ was speaking.
Absolutely.
So the local, if not the immediate context of the saying, consequently, weighs strongly, even if not perhaps decisively, back in the direction that even though God can and even does destroy some souls as well as bodies in Gehenna, which adds more weight toward Gehenna representing the lake of fire, judgment, after the general resurrection, by the way, nevertheless, God does not intend this as a hopeless punishment, but instead graciously values rational creatures, even if they are currently impenitent creatures, more than to be disposable trash. What about the Son disavowing to the Father those Christians who have disavowed the Son? Doesn't that get around the reassurance? Nope. The men who would later become the apostolic authorities themselves all disavowed Christ on the night of his arrest, none more so than Simon Peter, and Jesus still sought them out to reconcile with them. Jesus clearly didn't say, well, they had their chance and they blew it, so now I am definitely going to disavow them to the Father and never do anything to reconcile them back to us. Much less did Jesus choose to act in that finally rejective way. He sought out those cut off, wilted flowers, and he brought them back to life.
Hope you realize how many Baptists you're pissing off right now.
I am a Baptist, so that's okay. Nor can someone get around Jesus' reassurances about God's intentions by foisting a finally hopeless judgment onto the Father, from whom we are somehow by the Son protected, which would make less than no sense on any Trinitarian theism and would not even make sense on any lesser Christology. For the Son himself, on one hand, says he joins the Father in the judgment against those who deny him. So there is no division in intention there. And on the other hand, he also says that the Father, not merely himself, the Son, values people more than flowers, which are thrown into the fiery furnace. Perfectly together in intention, both ways. To put the conclusion more shortly, when a loving parent says to a rebelliously unjust child, I brought you into this world and I can take you out of it, that reflects a real point on which we ought to respect our parents, whether for better or sometimes for the worse. But that doesn't mean our mother or father is certainly going to annihilate us or torment us in punishment forever with no hope. On the other hand,
you just nailed that idiom. You just nailed that idiomatic expression, because how many times have our parents said, I'm going to kill you?
Yeah.
Wring your neck, things like that. It's like,
I'm going to wring your neck. That's really good.
Yeah, I mean, I both South and North here, so I've experienced both.
Yeah. I'm in the South. Yep, heard that.
What they're trying to do is put that holy fear into you for your own sake. They're actually trying to destroy you. They're trying to destroy your rebellion.
When parents go on to actually do that, then we say, man, those people are monsters. They need to be locked up or strung up maybe by their neck.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Jesus indicates with that other nearby warning, directly referencing himself and the Father, that we ought to be wary about the judgment brought against us by God if we betray him, and so to fear God more in that regard than to fear evil persons. But the proper response to the God who cares for us more than for the grass that is thrown into the trash, like the trash into the furnace, the God who gives himself to the very death for our sake while we are still rebels against him, is not wary fear of a threat, but respectful numinous fear leading into adoration. Since I'm passing there, go ahead.
Spend a minute talking about the word numinous. I know
numinous.
Lewis fan.
Numinous is an adjective. Numinous is an adjective, and it reflects the awe of the sublime. It's the case of where you're trying to emotionally or intellectually grasp something that you just can't quite get a hold of. It's bigger than you are.
And religiously speaking, it reflects transcendence.
Right. It reflects your recognition of transcendence, something that transcends you.
And what C.S. Lewis says is that there's nothing that so terrifies the mortal soul than an experience of the numinous.
That's right. They're all the sublime. Yep. Since I'm passing nearby, and boy, do I still have a lot of material to cover here, but that's okay. I'm about halfway done. That's the main argument, but there's a lot more going on in these sections of Matthew and Luke, and some of these things have interesting connections, have interesting connections to things we've already talked about in previous episodes, and have interesting connections to things in the Old Testament that I think are worth looking into, and a few of them are things that people might say, well, doesn't that knock out universal salvation? And some of them are things where people would say, hey, you know, that kind of looks like post-mortem salvation, doesn't it? Or what am I looking at there? So there's all kinds of other little interesting things around these verses in the context. The Gospel scene includes Luke's report of a warning from Jesus, that's at Luke 12, 57 through 59, that I've already discussed at length back in my chapter on the main block of Gehenna warnings, thus connecting this block topically with that block, namely the warning that if we Christians, even up to Jesus' own chief apostles, insist on our enemies, up to and including our adversary, the anti-just one, a nickname for Satan, being thrown to the tormentors in prison and not being reconciled to our king or with us, we ourselves will be thrown to the tormentors in prison. Not hopelessly so. We can get out when we've paid the last cent, or in the Greek coinage, the final lepton. In that earlier warning aimed directly at St. Peter and the apostles, the final cent owed wasn't the money the traitorous steward had embezzled, but what the steward had finally angered his king enough to be thrown into prison for, a refusal to reconcile with other people himself, and an insistence that they should be put into a punishment that on his own grounds of their imprisonment, they'd never be able to leave. The same principle is true in this version, although the surface details are somewhat different. Yet, they're equally shocking, since Satan himself, or whomever is our greatest archenemy, is our legal opponent with whom we're supposed to be reconciling, the anti-just one. Sure, you could reply that Satan fits the embezzling, treacherous chief servant of Matthew's version of this parable. That's been Matthew 18, verses 21 through 35, and I wouldn't disagree at all. I would even agree that in theme, we ourselves, as followers of Christ, are being warned from both sides of that dispute. From the side bringing judgment in Matthew's report, and from the side being dragged to judgment in Luke's report. But then there's our Lord's own chief apostle, Simon Peter, and if Peter and the other apostles, then all of us as Christians, being compared unfavorably, of course, to Satan again. And if Satan is the character thrown to the tormentors in prison in Gosmat, then even Satan still has permission to leave once he pays the last cent of what he owes, which in that parable was mercy and reconciliation. And if you answer, well, yeah, theoretically, sure, but Satan's never going to pay mercy and reconciliation, and neither will some other people, then I'll answer, the challenge posed by Jesus in either version of the parable is whether you yourself will do so. Are you going to insist that your enemies never reconcile with you, and that you will never reconcile with your enemies? And so in principle, neither should you reconcile with God, whom you make your enemy by even your smallest injustice. This has no small bearing on how you and I, of course, insist on interpreting the key verses for this chapter about God who has authority and power to destroy both body and soul in Gehenna, and about what is and isn't involved in denying Christ before men. And such deniers being denied by the Son before his Father in the heavens. But someone will say, Jesus goes on in both scenes to warn that he did not come to cast down peace on the earth, but to cast a fire, not to bring peace, but a sword, not to grant peace, but rather division, even between families. That's in Gosmat chapter 12, verses 34 through 37, and Luke chapter 12, verses 49 through 53. That's true, but let me apply Christ's words literally from the Greek of Luke's report. That's in 1249. What do you wish if the fire was already kindled? Hi, Adeline. Jesus is asking this about what he wishes, and since we may safely suppose Jesus already knows what he intends by kindling the fire, the question is, what do we think he intends? This gets back to that previous much larger block of main Gehenna warnings again, because Jesus explains in Mark's report, that's Gospel Mark 9, 49, 50, about as clearly as anyone could expect what his purpose is for the unquenchable fire of Gehenna, called in Matthew's report of that scene, the fire, the Aeonian, as in his report of Jesus' judgment of the sheep and the goats at the end of Gosmat 25. If you haven't watched that episode yet, I recommend it after leaving this one. If you already have, you either already know how Jesus explains his purpose, insulting everyone with that fire, or you still disagree with my inferences there for some reason, in which case at least we can know our point of contention between us for this topic. What if Jesus wishes the fire was already kindled? What does that involve? Since I just parenthetically connected back to the end of Matthew 25 and the judgment of the sheep and the goats, that judgment, as you may already know or may remember from my prior episode on it, is part of a larger block of 4 judgment sayings going back at least as far as what we now call Matthew's chapter 24, verses 45 through 51. There, the warnings start with Jesus telling his apostles and disciples, who are the only people Matthew reports in the scene, which happens on Olive Hill the night before Jesus leaves the temple, after Jesus leaves the temple for the final time, that they had better keep up an expectation that he will be returning after he leaves, and tells them a parable of an abusive chief servant who convinced himself his master wouldn't be coming back and so started taking advantage of his authority over the other servants, and then was fatally surprised when the master returned and cut him into pieces for his evil ways, assigning him a place with the unbelievers where the weeping is and the gnashing of the teeth. And that's a phrase which, by comparing 2 forms of the parable of the lazy servant, like I did back in that episode, reported both in Luke and soon afterward by Matthew in 25 verses 14 through 30, we know involves a punishment to the death. Slay him in my presence, as Jesus puts it in the Luke report. Well, here's another version of that same judgment warning in Gospel Luke 13, 35 through 48, reported by Luke nearby the main verses under consideration for this episode. It even comes with a version of the parable Matthew reports immediately afterward to start his 25th chapter about the wise and foolish virgins in Gospel, waiting for their master to return and the foolish virgins being locked out. As an aside, my harmonization guess is that Jesus told these parable warnings at different times to his disciples within a week or 2 of each other, but I acknowledge it's possible that Luke or Matthew or even both may have picked up the material from an earlier source report and moved it with some small modifications to one or both of these scenes for the sake of topical emphasis.
I think it's important to point out that our I guess you could say sophisticated literary style of today was not what was in vogue in
their idea of sophisticated literary style was very different.
They didn't narratives didn't necessarily have to follow a chronological flow. It was more like the point of the story, so whatever fed into the point of the story, more like a logical flow than a chronological flow.
Right, exactly. Now all the gospels do have a broadly chronological flow, and some of them are more so than others, but Matthew and Luke have a tendency to just kind of pick up material and put it in logically where they sounds good.
And it's important to know this because it addresses some discrepancies between some of the gospels as far as the order of events.
Absolutely.
The order of events usually took the form that most made the point that the author was trying to make, not necessarily the chronological unfolding of the events.
And that can make it a little difficult when you're coming back historically to try to figure out, well, when exactly did Jesus heal that centurion's son? Was it before he went into this town, or was it after he went into this town?
I had in mind when I was saying that.
Yeah. It doesn't ultimately matter, but it does. I mean, if he obviously didn't do it twice, it's obviously the same scene.
Well, I mean,
some scenes are look the same but are different. But
the real easy way to see through that one is that a servant represented the master. So in one, it's pretty clear that he's talking to a representative, whereas the other, it seems as though he's talking to the actual person.
Absolutely,
by extrapolation.
Yeah, but that doesn't solve the timing problem.
Right. These are cultural, idiomatic, flow of thought issues that in our modern Western ideal, we've gotten rather mathematic about how we present literature and how we present narratives. However, the history of not just philosophy but human thought is really reflective of the history of how we ordered our thoughts. And if you look anthropologically at how different cultures ordered their thoughts through their literature, we really stand apart. Western society, even from Eastern society today, is still, you can see it online. There's a culture clash there because there's a different way of organizing thoughts, and we assume this universal logical flow that isn't necessarily always the most pragmatic approach to understanding things. And so it's just my way of addressing that tendency to Western culture snobbery or whatnot, where we assume our way of looking at things is the only way to look at things. And it's like, well, no, we have a very rich history and a lot of divergences of cultures that inform the various ways that we can look at these things. And we do ourselves such a disservice by just trying to see things anachronistically through these modern eyes rather than putting ourselves in those shoes of the person at the time.
Well, and I hope also when people are watching this that they come away with an appreciation of how all these punishment warnings are connected with each other. I mean, just on this relatively minor Gehenna warning, we're getting back to the main Gehenna block. We're getting back to the sin against the Holy Spirit in a couple of different ways. We're getting back to the scene with the sheep and the goats, because here's Luke reporting Jesus giving different versions of those parables of judgment about the abusive chief servant and things. They're all connected with one another topically. In my prior episode focusing on Matthew 25, I opened up the question of whether the foolish virgins are supposed to be real servants of the bridegroom, in other words, servants of Christ, of God, whether directly or by being servants of his bride. I addressed that question since I have seen commentators, and as you might expect, they're typically Calvinistic, although soft Arminians expecting once saved, always saved could try this too, trying to argue that those women weren't supposed to be real servants. They had just wandered in off the street. No, they hadn't. They hadn't done that. Or they had been temporarily hired for the occasion. That's culturally possible, I allowed, but not likely in the context of the bridegroom being at least wealthy and, in other parables, royalty, and therefore able and expected to provide his own servants. Moreover, I pointed out, the parables immediately before and afterward in Matthew's account are super explicitly about chief servants chosen and empowered by God for the purpose of being his servants. And they're getting into fatal trouble with God for various reasons, mostly having to do with lack of charity and evangelism. So it would be topically weird if the foolish virgins weren't as much servants of the bridegroom as the wise virgins. But there's no room for dispute in Luke's report of Jesus giving a similar warning here. That's chapter 13, verses 35 through 40. Let your loins be girded in readiness, Jesus says, and keep your lamps alight. See, there's that thing. And be like men who are waiting for their master when he returns from the wedding feast, so that they may instantly open up the door for him when he comes and knocks.
So should we spend a minute on Old Testament typology here?
Go ahead. I need to break for a second to drink.
The oil is always been representative of the Holy Spirit. That's what the anointing was. When the word anointing means to smear, and what they would do is they would dab the oil on the thumb and smear the forehead, and that's how you would anoint them with oil. I know we all get this picture of people dumping oil on top of their head, and they never. Olive oil is way too expensive to do stuff like that.
Right. Well, it depends. If you're a king, you can pour olive oil.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
But the regular tradition was to take a dab on the thumb and smear it on the forehead, and this was a sign of some kind of honor or authority or right that was bestowed upon a person.
Oh, yeah, that's literally where the word Messiah and Christos comes from.
Exactly, the anointed one of God. That's what it means. And Mashiach.
Hamashiach.
The Mashiach, the Messiah, the anointed one of God. That's the Ezekiel, I believe, the Ezekiel and Isaiah title, Mashiach Nagid, the anointed King of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just want to say that all of these pictures that Christ draws with parables draw directly upon Old Testament typography. Symbolism or symbology that was clearly understood to the contemporary audience of the time to have a very discrete meaning. So when he talks about the virgins that you were discussing, they've already been consecrated. They've already been assigned this purpose. They're not just people off the street.
And not just people hired for it either.
Right. This is the place of.
Well, we know for a fact they can't be just people hired for it, because in this version of the parable, they are definitely not people just hired for it.
Oh, absolutely not. They're all members of the same group. Only some of them are diligent, and others,
are not. And what are they not being diligent about? Well, they're not being diligent about behaving good, basically. We'll get to that in a second.
Living in light of the vigilance of Christ, living in light of what's expected of you. That's how I interpreted that.
But what they're expected to do is not abuse other people.
Exactly.
There's some pretty in the in the version of the talents and the minas that we talked about in that other episode. The the lazy servant who has the talent or the mina, that's not a small amount of money. That's a huge amount of money. And he's being dressed down because he refused to in any way support the family business.
Wasn't a talent several years' wages?
A talent was specifically it was a talenton, and it was the largest monetary unit. It was like 10,000 pounds of silver.
You say it's like $1 billion.
Yeah, easily. Now a mino was not that much, but it was still pretty significant. It was more than just a day's wage. That might have been a year's wage. I can't remember offhand, but talenton was a ludicrously large amount of money. So this is not just some rando that Christ chose. These are people that he chose. He was expecting them and honoring them to work for him. These are the chief servants. And in the other parables around, it is the chief servant. It is the number one chief servant who gets in trouble. We're going to see that again here in a second too. So anyway, these
the buck stops here.
Yeah, the buck stops here, all right, with them being cut to pieces. But keeping in mind, it's the Christians who are being warned about this. It's the apostles and chief disciples who are being warned about this.
That seems to be the recurring theme throughout all of this stuff, that it's like we don't see it because of our cultural...
Yeah, we're expecting it to mean, that just talks about those heathens over there or whatever.
I don't know if you read the post on my wall in introducing today's episode, but I was talking a lot about that, how we get so outwardly focused in the gospel.
No, I haven't read that yet.
Yeah, where Christ focuses us inward, saying, work out your own salvation.
Yeah, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is the God who is working within you. That's from Paul, but yeah. Well, these people who are waiting for the bridegroom to come in, they're still the master's servants, or slaves, really, it's the same word. As Jesus continues with a promise of culturally unexpected radical reward. When the master comes, he will gird himself and have them recline at the table and come up and serve them, whether he comes in the second or the third watch of the night. Doesn't matter how late. That's amazing. That's just like crazy. You wouldn't expect that to happen. He's blowing his people's minds on the road, telling them that this is going to happen. Nor does Simon Peter think there's any question Jesus is addressing his own disciples. His question in verse 41 is whether other people are also being addressed, not only the disciples. Now, it may seem odd that Jesus doesn't answer him directly, but instead with another parable. That's in chapter 13, verses 42 through 48. And that parable parallels Matthew's report of the warning about the abusive chief servant, a parable which in Luke's report also has an explicitly lesser but real warning along the way for those servants who don't know the master's will, unlike by implication the chief servant. But I think the implication of what Peter meant to be asking and Jesus' choice of reply is clear from how the exchange develops. Peter wanted to know if the promise of reward applied to everyone, not only to the disciples. We know he had to have had the wrong attitude about his question. He must not have wanted everyone to be rewarded in such a culturally radical way, only the faithful chief servants like himself. By how Jesus ramps his answer into a warning of much more painful punishment coming to abusive chief servants who, unlike those who did not know and committed deeds worthy of blows, have all the advantages from the master but abuse their position anyway. From everyone who has been given much, much shall be required, Jesus says. The follow-up saying in the second part of verse 48 is also interesting. And to whom they entrusted much, they will ask all the more from him. Grammatically, this seems to refer to Jesus' disciples entrusting much to Jesus and asking all the more from him. Is this part of the rebuke to Peter for selfish ingratitude, or a reference to the unexpected reward of the master serving the faithful servants? It could be both. I will observe that on a harmonization theory, which I prefer, where both groups of sayings are historical, when Jesus comes back to these parables again in Matthew's report, he's alone with the apostles and disciples, not part of the crowd on the road. And unlike here, the bad servants are described as foolish young women who now join the parable of expectation and are left out of the nuptial conclusions. And the abusive servant is more clearly cut to death in pieces. The focus upon the apostles as Jesus' audience accompanies a ramp-up of Jesus' warnings against rebel servants he himself has chosen. Nor can those warnings be daffed away onto Judas Iscariot. Simon Peter is the one whom Jesus is shooting against, as usual, back here in the Gospel scene. This notion that some punishments, namely those thrown down on the greatest rebels among Jesus' own servants, are worse than others, also has a parallel, though, in a different parable back in Gospel 10, in the same scene about the warning to fear him who is strong both to destroy the body and the soul in Gehenna. Jesus tells his disciples, as he is sending them out on their evangelical mission, not to the Gentiles yet at that time from Matthew's scene, that Sodom and Gomorrah themselves will be able to tolerate the coming day of judgment better than the Jewish cities who reject his ambassadors. This idea of lesser and greater punishment isn't easy to square with ideas of either annihilation, where every finally lost soul suffers equally with annihilation out of existence, or else standard versions of eternal conscious torment, where in the context of infinite torment, variations of degree drop to meaninglessness. But it opens up another topical set of Jesus' warnings, and we'll be getting to that in the next episode. But before I finish this episode, let me take some time to consider the Old Testament prophecy which Jesus is citing during these somewhat similar, somewhat different scenes reported in Gospel 10 and Gospel Luke 12, the wording being a bit more obvious in Matthew's report. This will have some interesting connections to Trinitarian theism, too, through the claims Jesus is tacitly making for himself as himself, capital H, in the incident reported by Matthew. The reference is to what, in our modern chapters and verses, we would now call Micah 7, although what's happening starts back at the beginning of Micah chapter 6. Get ready, because this is pretty cool. I was so geeked out when I found this. Micah is a literary work of the prophet Micah of Moresheth, that is such a great word, who worked in the southern kingdom of Judah around the same time as Isaiah was working in Israel, and Hosea also. That's the northern kingdom. Micah, under God's inspiration, structures his prophecy as a series of complaints from God, somewhat sarcastically answering back to facetious complaints from his people in Judah and Jerusalem, and also in Samaria, which was part of the northern kingdom of 10 Hebrew tribes, soon to be judged to destruction by God.
Our vocabulary word of the day is dialectic.
Dialectic, that's right. That prophecy is a dialectic, where you have God saying some things, and then the people are saying other things, and then you have the prophet in the middle, and he's kind of commenting on both sides. And boy, does he comment. Its comments are really interesting, and we're going to be getting to those here in a minute. When God is talking about Israel here, he means all his Jewish people of the day, not only in the northern kingdom of Israel, because he's kind of holding them up. What's going to happen to Israel is going to happen to Judah and Jerusalem too, if y'all don't straighten up and fly right. So what we now call chapters 6 and 7 finish out this short book, or it was originally a scroll. So here we go. God is sarcastically asking, how has he offended or wearied his people by bringing them up out of slavery in Egypt and sending them prophets like Moses, the greatest prophet who ever lived, and even inspiring pagan, fake prophets like Balaam, son of Beor, to truly prophesy in their favor, when Balaam had been paid and threatened to prophesy against them? The Lord, Jehovah, doesn't really require burnt offerings, not in thousands of rams, in 10,000 rivers of oil. Nor has God been asking for something his people ought to detest, but haven't always done so, like the sacrifice of their firstborn children to save their souls from sin. Ooh, that was an interesting little analogy that went by. What does Jehovah require of you, says Micah? And this may be the high water mark of all religious thought in the Jewish scriptures, to which everything else is a commentary.
Here, crescendo, I just want to add, he said that it never even entered my mind.
Never even entered my mind. Yep. What does Jehovah require of you? But to be fair in government, to intimately love loving kindness, that word for faithful devotion to other people, especially by God to his creations, and to walk humbly with your God.
So I have exactly 2 rules for my children. Those 2 rules, very briefly, are don't be a douche, don't be a dumbass. Well, that's the law and the prophets summed up in the nutshell.
That's kind of the law and the prophets summed up, yeah. Yep. Well, this is also that other famous summing up the law and the prophets. Do justice and loving kindness and mercy, and walk humbly with your God.
And you see Christ's positive affirmation instead of my negation. Don't do this, don't do that. He's like, no, wait. No, not doing stuff is not good enough. No, you've got to
positively do it.
You need to actively participate in doing righteousness.
Which is justice.
Absolutely. Just togetherness.
Yep, fair togetherness. The English adverb humbly there translate a Hebrew word meaning shattered or pulverized, while shattered with your God, well, pulverized with your God. But the poetic imagery here refers to people not being tough-hearted as a symbol for pride. God, the high and exalted one who dwells in the ongoing height, whose name is holy and who dwells in a high and holy place, dwells also with the lowly of spirit, whose hearts have been pulverized, as Isaiah reports God saying in Isaiah 57:15, a verse almost as famous as this one. And he doesn't dwell there to keep them crushed down, even when God himself has been the one to shatter them, but instead to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the shattered. It's important to keep in mind, both here and over at Isaiah and across the Jewish scriptures commonly, it is God who shatters the heart of the proud. In fact, he's warning here in Micah 6, he's going to do just that, because the people insist on exploiting and cheating each other, especially the rich and oppressing the poor, which is why the word for doing fair legal judgments is used here instead of the word for justice more broadly. We say justice, love justice. What the actual word is, be fair in your legal judgments. But that's what God's been complaining about.
We like justice because it talks about punishing other people.
Yeah. People love justice, and in their minds they translate that, but that's not really what God was talking about here, or usually, for that matter, when talking about justice. So God takes authoritative responsibility for sending sickness and war upon them, even though the poor will suffer along with the rich and the innocent, so far as there are any, along with the treacherous cheaters, whether those are rich or poor. But the doers of injustice, in 6:16, will be the ones who shall bear the reproach of God's people. Micah personally continues commenting on the situation and on God's coming judgment, going into the first third of chapter 7. All the people, not only the rich, but them especially, have started fighting against each other, betraying each other, like they're waiting to ambush each other in murder with nets. Is the right or the left hand godly? No, both do evil well. This will be magnified when the armies come, but the point of chapter 7, verse 5, which is the verse being quoted by Jesus in the scene both Matthew and Luke are reporting here, is that people are already betraying one another. For a son treats his father with contempt. A daughter rises up against her mother and against her husband's mother. A person's enemies are the people of his own household. And so the cycle of mistrust and betrayal feeds on itself, since people insist on being so untrustworthy. Do not trust in a neighbor. Do not trust in a friend. Do not give even your lips to your lover in bed. It's because of such unjust and unloving behavior toward each other that God sends the fiery punishment, by an army in this case. Jesus casts fire on the earth as well. And notice the subtle connotation of responsibility here, with Jesus claiming the judgmental authority of Jehovah Elohim Most High, and also claiming the superior loyalty from people that ought to be reserved for God alone, because the one who loves father or mother more than Jesus is not worthy of Jesus, Jesus says in Matthew 10, verses 34 through 37, just right next door. Essentially, Jesus is putting himself on par with the love of the first commandment. You shall love Jehovah your Elohim and have no other gods before him. The only love that can trump the love which God expects and God commands toward our mothers and fathers. And Jesus knows that in coming, he brings a sword of war, and so he accepts and insists, like Jehovah, on the active responsibility of setting family members against each other, but not because this is what he ultimately wants. He wants people to fulfill justice in love with each other in trustworthy loyalty and to stop having such hard hearts, even if he must make our hearts contrite, pulverized, shattered first.
The very Prince of Peace came not to bring peace, but to bring a sword.
Bring a sword, but it loops back into being at peace.
Absolutely.
He brings a sword because we're not at peace. We insist on not being at peace.
And this, and I don't want to make a big segue of this. Just a brief aside. A lot of us at the Wandering Pilgrims, me and Justin in particular, have been talking a lot about Rene Girard for the past year, and mimetic theory. And this is really what it comes down to is, if we're going to be a barbaric people, it serves us far better to live that barbaricism out explicitly rather than have it hidden, as we've learned to do as a culture. We've learned to couch our barbarism in such civilized terms. And
it's hard to detect and point out how bad it is when we do that.
And that's what makes hypocrisy so toxic.
Hypocrisy so toxic. Yeah,
absolutely. So I just wanted to say that touches upon that, and I think that one of the things that Christ did more than anything was to lay bare the deception, or as he called it, the leaven of the Pharisees, where they couched their unrighteousness in righteous terms.
Yeah. Let's go back to Micah 7 now, and the context subsequent to what Jesus referenced. The prophet Micah knows, of course, this is so great, get ready. The prophet Micah knows that there are at least some good and godly people remaining, and he knows he's one of them himself. But does he flee from sharing the punishment? No. Does he even claim that he will be afflicted unjustly? No. He watches and waits for the God of his salvation, but he expects to fall and to make his home in darkness. That's a poetic way of saying he expects to die along with his fellow people. But the enemies of his people coming to devastate them in war should not rejoice in his death, for although he falls, his God shall hear him and be a light in the darkness for him. And he shall rise again, brought out of the darkness and into the light, to see the justice of God done for him. His enemies will be cast down in that day to come, and shall be trampled like mire in the street. Now, that's language about the resurrection from the dead. So you're saying, well, Micah, he's talking about the resurrection of the righteous here, obviously. Not exactly, because Micah says about himself, slain in hope, that he himself has sinned against God. Therefore, he will stand against the wrath of Jehovah. He's not standing
in sinner talking. Sounds like a sinner talking.
Yeah. He's not standing against the wrath of Jehovah in a penitent rebellion, in an impenitent rebellion. He's standing in the sense of accepting the wrath as a necessary discipline that will bring about good for Micah. And it isn't only going to bring about good for Micah in that day of the Lord to come, and not only good for the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem, who shall grow in that day to build out her walls and extend her boundaries, but also in that day, this is all part in Micah 7, when the whole earth shall become desolate because of her inhabitants on account of the fruit of their unjust deeds. In that day, the pagans shall come to Jerusalem from Assyria and the cities of Egypt, and from the river Euphrates, that's where Babylon was in Micah's day, even from sea to sea and from mountain to mountain, wherever the deeds of injustice have wrought the fruit of desolation. They shall come to be the people of the great shepherd, the flock of his inheritance. Now, no doubt, that includes any Jews in those lands, but it also explicitly includes the nations, the pagans, who shall be ashamed of all their might, coming out of their fortresses with trembling, to come to Jehovah, our God, in dread, to tremble before him. And is he a God who punishes evil? Yes, whether the evildoers are Jews or Gentiles. But how does Micah describe the God before whom the rebel nations surrender and come before in trembling fear? Jehovah is a God unlike any other, who pardons injustice and passes over the rebellious acts of his shattered possessions, for they are still his possessions, and he shall have them for himself. He does not retain his anger going forward or forever, because he rejoices in loving kindness. When Micah says God will thus give faithfulness to Jacob and loving kindness to Abraham, the faithfulness and love, which he punishes their descendants and pagans together for not having toward one another, Micah means and says that God shall thus be keeping his promises to those patriarchs from days of old to have compassion on his rebel people, and in Abraham's case, to bless all nations and to bring all Abraham's descendants to righteousness, even so that they will number more than the stars in the sky. Treading their injustices underfoot is good for them, because by doing so, God casts all their sins, Micah says all our sins, into the depths of the sea. I haven't yet discussed the several Old Testament promises about the pagans also being the inheritance of God, even of the Son from the Father, nor how this necessarily connects, by the incarnation of God the Son no less, to the covenant made with Abraham. But in prior episodes, I have occasionally talked about how Jesus, speaking for and as God, raises in resurrection people who, by Old Testament reference, shall come to him to be taught by him and forgiven of their sins. At any rate, when Jesus references this portion of Scripture, he isn't talking about some kind of hopelessly final family chaos from which only a few shall be eventually saved, even though he affirms a day of tragic family chaos is coming. When Micah counts himself as a sinner among the ones who shall be slain in their sins by God, he also thus counts those sinners into his expectation of salvation from sin after death and back into loyal love under the shepherding of God. It's true, the proud and the haughty shall lick the dust like a serpent, as he says, but the context shows that this is a figure of penitent humility, coming back out of rebellion against God and into a chastened loyalty again. And if that description of a serpent licking the dust sounds familiar, it should, and the connotations are exactly the same. But that may be going too far for some readers yet, so I'll return to it later, maybe much, much later. Micah, accounting himself among the rebel Jews being punished by God for their transgressions, says he will bear the indignation of Jehovah because he has sinned against him. In Hebrew, this term for bearing is the same idea that Jesus talks about in Gospel 10:15, where Sodom and Gomorrah will tolerate or be able to stand up to the judgment of God in the day of judgment, better than some Jewish cities who reject the coming of Jesus. And that topically is going to lead into my next episode, and that will be a week or so from now. Oh my gosh, he's gone. I've killed him. At least we're still going. I wonder who's left. Did everybody leave? There goes my. Oh, there he is. Okay.
I'm trying to keep track of like comments on Facebook and stuff, and I'm totally tracking everything you're saying. It's like, but then I got to navigate the screens back to. Oh wait, I got to unmute my mic.
And my camera just bit the dust. Bit the dust. My camera licks the dust. So yeah, I mean, when Jesus's comment about there from Micah about the family throwing a sword on the earth and the families being against each other, that ends up actually referring to a universal salvation prophecy from Micah.
Beating their swords into plowshares. That's the first thing that makes me think of is that's
I don't remember if that's exactly if that's in the Micah verses, but there are verses like that's from Isaiah, isn't it?
To me, it's a cross reference to that verse in was it Acts? I think it is. Is it Acts?
I'm not sure.
Where it talks about, well, I mean, there's Old Testament verses that it's actually quoting. I was thinking about the New Testament.
Are you talking about Joel? Joel is pretty important in Acts.
Yes,
in the first part of the first sermons.
I think you're correct. Where it talks about the nations of the earth will beat their swords into plowshares and they will wage war no more.
Well, that's what's happening here at the end of Micah, and it's everybody basically. It's all the people that God has beat down into the darkness. They're going to come out,
and it's all a consistent end to conflict. Is really what it all amounts to. Is Christ is saying, look, I'm not an overlord in the sense where I'm going to sit here and micromanage and tell you every little thing you need to do for your life. But you need to straighten your relationships out. You need to straighten your stuff out, because one way or the other, it's going to be straightened out. Either the easy way or the hard way.
Exactly. Either the easy way or the hard way.
In the kingdom of heaven, there will be no liars. There will be no thieves. There will be no violent people or anything like that. And whatever it takes to accomplish that, one way or the other, yes, I'm going to bring you there, but I'm not going to bring you there like that.
Right. Exactly. What did George MacDonald, how did he put it? You don't get to skulk into heaven under the shadow of an imputed righteousness. That's not what impute means in the New Testament.
Right,
so,
right.
The word is there, but that's not what it means. It's not like a pretend righteousness that you're just being legally said, well, you're righteous even though you're not. No, your righteousness has to surpass that of the Pharisees.
There's definitely controversy between the Baptist, and I hear it a lot, the Baptist influence and how you couch your terms. How you say imputed, whereas I believe the Catholics would use the word infused.
And, that's true, yeah.
And I think that both of those words are right. I think that they both approach different angles to see it. And
the Greek word doesn't have the normal meaning that we think of for impute. The Greek word is simply accounting. I mean, it's an accounting metaphor from
it's mathematical figures.
It's like, okay, checking off this thing,
balancing the ledger, and I think that one thing that we got to remember is when we talk about righteousness and God repaying, it's not simply a matter of a good for every wrong, because that doesn't balance the scales. It's what good undoes the wrong. And that's what God's in the business of doing, is undoing wrong,
and bringing people to be good.
And if you want to be highly theological about it, you could say, well, the doctrine of probatio boni says that God is constantly in the business of adding unto us that which is lacking. It's not as though he's actually working in opposition of anything. It's that he's giving that which is an absence in what would normally be a good free moral agent.
Right. Right, and that comes back to the idea of the consuming fire, the fire of the Aeonian, of the unquenchable fire of Gehenna, that being the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we look at it from the terms of being something being taken from us, because that's our perspective. You know, we see our privation as an abundance of a thing when we don't realize it's good minus. Is what privation is. It's good minus. It's like there's good things about these desires. If you're feeling lustful towards your neighbor's wife, well, that comes from a good desire to procreate. I mean, we're supposed to want
It's a misdirected desire, but it's still a good desire.
Exactly. Right. And that's really where a lot of people misunderstand privatio boni, is that it's the idea that it's not as though there's a substance that is subtracted. It's that there's an order that's subtracted, where we have all the elements for goodness here, all the right elements for desire. It's these desires are not ordered properly.
They're in a chaos. They're in a chaos. That's a term. I mean, that is literally the term that's used in the Greek versions of the Bible.
When you'd rather just have sex than have kids and everything that comes with it, that's an example of privation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and also, when we want to do that instead of having a personal relationship with the other person, that's privational boni.
You really want to read what I wrote. I was up at like 4 o'clock this morning, and it just came to me all in a flow, and I spent like an hour.
Get this. This ties back also to what we were talking about in the episode on when I covered a lot of stuff from Goss John, because one of the points that Jesus talks about there in John 12, I think, is that he owns a Honda. No, I'm just kidding. That's a different joke. What he's talking about there is that the judgment of God is itself Aeonian life. That what we're going to be given, even in judgment, is Aeonian life. It's what we need. It's just that we're not cooperating with it yet. So it's causing some problems. We're causing the problems.
So I don't feel so bad about this, because I know we're at the tail end, so it's okay to have a couple.
Yeah, you can hair off now. I've finished the material.
One thing that I've really gravitated towards is saying, okay, think about it this way. Say you're an evolutionist, and there's a valid place for that in the theology as well. Say that you believe in not just biological evolution, but spiritual evolution, that we are evolving to a greater state of being, which seems to be intrinsic to most humanistic philosophies anyway. I know Jainism and Shintoism and Taoism and all that stuff. One way or the other, the idea is that if there is a spiritual component to people, is that we are progressing towards a greater and greater way of being. And we know that time is no difference from height, width, or depth, physics speaking, that time is just another dimension of freedom, a dimension of movement. So if we can really entertain these transcendent ideas for a second and see life experience and time and all of that as merely being the unfolding of the eventuality of who we always have been, the eternal me, the eternal now, that which always is, but we're always becoming into that. If we can see things through those eyes, then we begin to see that our own self, our ultimate self, the pinnacle of what we can possibly be, is not bound by time and is ever reaching back, counseling us, speaking to us, trying to bring us to where it is. I don't really have the capacity to differentiate that from God. Now, I know that God is wholly different, altogether separate. I believe
Categorically different.
Yeah, categorically different. So God definitely is above all of this. What I'm saying is, from our perspective, we don't have the capacity to differentiate between our perfected self and God himself, which is one of the reasons why Satan is so able to appear as an angel of light and fool us into thinking that he's the one with the actual credentials. because it's that visceral, that corporeal judgment that doesn't take into account that deeper knowledge of what is, in spite of our epistemological approach to understanding. I think I convoluted something that should have been really simple there, but
it's a good try though.
But that's all I'm saying is for the people who are so against the idea of the authority of God, I just don't really see how we can differentiate God's authority over our lives day to day, counseling us, guiding us, drawing us towards a righteous, absolute ideal, and our own selves in our eternal future seeking to minister to ourselves in our growth and development. Basically like a father raising a child that actually ends up being he himself.
Kind of in the idea that what we like Peter's angel, for example.
Yes, exactly. Oh man, that you just nailed it. That is what made me started thinking about this when the chick was all like Peter's angel. Like, she's like Peter's angel is outside trying to come in because they thought that he was dead. And I was thinking to myself, it's like, it sounds like she's talking about his soul.
Yeah.
It sounds like she's talking about Peter apart from his body, not this entity that's watching over Peter, like our concept of the guardian angel, but Peter's avatar, for lack of a better word.
But what if the guardian angel is our future self trying to help us under God become better people and protecting us?
Absolutely. And these are things that I got to watch out for taking too seriously because I don't want to build a doctrine off of speculation.
No, I understand. But there is a major biblical theory that connects kind of to this, which is the idea that when Jehovah, the visible Jehovah, is acting in the Old Testament, what we're actually seeing is the incarnate Christ.
Right, of course, the angel of the Lord.
Yeah, the angel of the Lord. But he's already incarnate. Not because chronologically he's incarnate. Basically, he's time traveling.
Here's something to run by you real quick, because this is a thought that Justin is one of the only guys who's actually followed me on this. I say that Christ is and always has been human simply because of the immutability of God. The hypostatic union doesn't...
Yeah, George MacDonald had something to say about that too.
I believe that reality is not a line, like a timeline, but it's a loop. It's a circle.
I wouldn't say it's a circle necessarily, but from the perspective of God,
well, this is just
omnipresently on all points, then it's translate back and forth.
I'm not trying to be literal here. I'm trying to say this is a conceptual tool. So the way that I conceive of it is that, of course, Alpha and Omega, beginning and the end. Christ has no origin, no beginning, no end. I say that he always has been, always will be human, yet he entered into existence at a discrete point 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, he incarnated at a discrete point 2,000 years ago, but he acts as the incarnated human Christ at all points in space and time in history.
That's the kicker, is that it flows in both directions. It doesn't just flow forward, it flows backwards as well.
Because he's transcendent to time, he can do that.
It's so beautiful that I'm talking.
And if he can do that, then he could theoretically empower us to do that too, to go back and be guardian angels for people we love.
That's what brought me to thinking of that.
Not because we become guardian angels when we die, but because we're talking about the resurrected people.
Because we always have been and always will be of this particular nature, and this temporal experience happens to be a unique departure from that. But that doesn't mean that we're actually absolutely disconnected from eternity. It just means that in our cognition here and now, we're not confronting eternity. It's our temporal nature right here and now that gives eternity its angles, where we can see the angles here and there, but we can't see that broad view. We can't see this through that God's eye lens, because this is part of the process of becoming. And this is the last thing I will say in this thought, because I'm pretty sure you're going to follow up with a whole bunch of stuff that I'm just going to shut up and listen to. But one of the really coolest thoughts that I've had is that there's a reason why God the biggest spoiled brat that the universe has ever known, if we want to look at it that way. If we want to look at it that way, that's what I'm saying. Because think of Richard Pryor in The Toy. You know, he could have anything he wants, anything, whatever he wants. He could choose any course of history, and the course that he chose was the Via Dolorosa, the road of suffering. Why, for the pinnacle of his works, would he choose for the being in whom all being subsists, and yet he chose to live, die, and be born again through the most torturous mechanism? This seems to say something to me, that our hedonistic default way of looking at life is really wrong-headed, and that we need to think higher about principle, about what's gained, about the cost of victory, the price of glory, the weight of glory, the weight of glory. That's
good C.S. Lewis reference. Yes.
It reminds me that the highest pleasures of life come through often the greatest pain.
Well, and in Trinitarian theology, from the perspective of what's called positive aseity, where God is actively self-begetting and self-begotten, God is the active ground of his own eternal self-existence. He didn't start to exist,
right?
But he's ever energetically self-existing. Okay, he's not just statically self-existing. But from this idea of God actively self-begetting and self-begotten, the self-begotten person of God is always surrendering back to the Father, always surrendering back to the self-begetting person of God. Okay,
and there's continual newness to this dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. But this surrender is constantly what the theologians call the kenosis. You know, it's all constantly outpouring, and so there's a self-sacrificial element or aspect to the very self-existent action of God.
The Philippians 2 aspect.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's not something that the Son starts to do when he's doing incarnation. That's something the Son was always doing, is always doing, always will be doing. Even if God had never created creation, God would still be doing this.
He is the ever-dying, ever-living man-God.
C.S. Lewis kind of approached this a little bit when he was talking in Miracles of Preliminary Study, which in his chapter on the grand miracle, which he also put it in an earlier version of as an essay. And he was borrowing it from George MacDonald, by the way. Those 3 chapters in Miracles are basically just a recapture of a whole book that George MacDonald had written. But he was talking about how when he was converting to Christianity, one of the things that he really liked, that really spoke to him from pagan religions, was the idea of a cyclical sort of thing, and the idea of God descending to rise again. And so here, actually fulfilling that completely, is Jesus, is God incarnate, coming as Jesus of Nazareth. And so he stoops to rise, he goes down to come up, and it's an idea that's expressed all throughout nature in a transposition, what he used to call a transposition in some other essays.
Almost seems like the Fibonacci sequence. It's like this recurring theme through all of literature, through all of art.
Maybe fractals are what you're thinking of.
Well, no, I'm thinking of the greater iterations of the previous. It's like there's always a dying and rebirth. Right. You know, the spiral out. You know, I get that.
Yeah, it's not a circle, right? It's not a circle. It's a spiral.
Well, a lot of what I'm thinking of,
it keeps going, but it keeps going in a spiral.
You might not be a fan of Tool, but I was thinking of Parabola, that whole album by Tool that's basically circling around the Fibonacci, and how, you know, you see the greater iterations of the rectangles all around, and everything it resembles what came before. And a lot of this can be seen in the Mandelbrot set, how the subsets very closely resemble the parenting figures, and yet they're distinctive in their own right. And that's it's like the fractal of reality. You're right to use the word fractal, which is what made me think of the Mandelbrot set. But I was, it's also again that ratio that the sum of the two previous equals the whole of the new one, and the sum of that equals the next one, and the greater and greater iterations. It's like this ever outward spiraling massive beauty,
and we
that is
shouldn't
creation.
mistake that for what God actually does and is, but it's a transposition of
It's a
what
framework.
God actually is and does into a minor key, as
Right.
Lewis would say.
It's a framework that allows degrees of freedom, but constrains the agent to a certain degree of beauty, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Okay.
So
and that's about how well, we should fear the authority of the one who has the power to destroy the soul in hell.
I was just about to say, I'm going to give you the final word, because it's like this really does come full circle, because we have the author of beauty being also the author of the ugliest possible thing, which is that which we fear.
Well, what we would think of as the ugliest possible thing, but for God, it's not the ugliest possible thing.
No, everything's beautiful.
Sin is the ugliest possible thing.
Everything is perfect and beautiful. Is merely through the subjective experience of the individual that our particular part takes on its particular characteristic in a discrete moment of time.
I wouldn't say sin is.
But wait.
Beautiful.
Let me just finish this one a little bit.
Okay,
what I was saying is, as you look back over your own timeline, yes, those individual moments, like you were just about to say, that sin, it was ugly as hell, literally.
Yeah.
However, fitting it into the greater picture, it forms the greatest beautiful mosaic that eternity could ever craft.
Right. God brings good out of it. Yeah.
It's not just that he brings good out of it, is that it is good altogether in discrete little increments, just like sodium chloride. You go ahead and try to drink sodium. Go ahead, try to drink chlorine. Both of them will kill you in an instant. You put them together, and you got something that we cannot live without table salt.
Right.
And that's what I see God, righteousness, and probatio boni as, is when you separate these intrinsic elements to one another, you create this toxicity that ultimately resolves in righteousness, but in the intermediary, in the separation moment, there's volatility. There's definite degradation. There's definite corrosion taking place.
Okay, that's an analogy. All right.
But all in all, if you look at the great picture, it was the flow of one perfection to another perfection. It's all perfection.
Do you have Paralandra there?
Oh yes. I love the space.
You should like pull that out right now and read the.
Well, I have it in digital format.
Yeah. I've got the book at the house. I don't have it here, or I would have been already out, man. I would have been like, okay, now we need to read the theophany at the end of Paralandra.
You know, the funny thing is that was my favorite of the trilogy until just recently, because I don't think I had the capacity to really grasp that hideous strength when I first read it. Even the second time that I read it, it still didn't quite resonate with me. But these days, as I reflect upon the political process and everything that's taking place around us, that hideous strength really seems like the most relevant piece of literature that can come
now, it's
to
not as poetically as beautiful as lots of places in Paralandra. So, I mean, you're still not going to find anything like the theophany in it. But
right.
But, I mean, yeah, it's that was the one I read first.
Really?
My English teacher in high school. I
read them in order. I read the Out of the Silent Planet first.
I really didn't even clearly know that there were two other books. I knew that they existed, but I had no clue really what they were even supposed to be about.
And Paralandra does kind of stand on its own merits.
Yeah, kind of.
I mean, it's not like
obviously a character from the previous book comes back and becomes a real problem.
Ransom or which one?
No, not Ransom. His opponent from Out of the Silent Planet.
Oh, what was his name? It's been a while.
Forget his name.
It's been probably 10 years since I read it.
Of course, again, I have the books at the house. He was one of the two guys who kind of shanghaied Ransom the first time. Hang on a minute.
The professor. The guy that had the high-minded ideas. I think I know who you're talking about. Well, in the meantime, let me fill in the audience about what we're talking about. In C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, he presented a panorama of what basically every ufologist dreams of. This guy by the name of Ransom, which his name was not chosen randomly. Ransom, he has a transcendent experience with this supposedly mad scientist that brings him in an impossible vessel into what we think of as lifeless space, but C.S. Lewis presented as this vibrant, bursting with life,
right?
Whole medium.
And he basically said, the scientist. There are two scientists. There's one who's the actual scientist, and then there's another guy who's
the pseudoscientist that's just riding off the coattails of.
Yeah, he's there to exploit stuff.
Yeah, he's the guy who actually abducts Ransom. He's trying to take him because no one will do it willingly, and he's basically saying he's a situational ethicist where he's like, Ransom will appreciate.
It's kind of like Flash Gordon, the guy kidnapping Flash Gordon and Dale and saying, "Look, the only reason I need you is because you got to put your foot on the thing over here."
Nice. I got the Queen theme song running through my head.
So anyway, and I can't remember his name, but anyway, so the guy he goes to Mars with Ransom, who's basically Token, and so they're there, and the angel of Mars sends everybody back.
He gets one story from the Twisted Dude, and then he actually meets the Eldils. Yeah, the guys that are really in charge and stuff, and they set him straight. Like this is a sinless land. It's an ancient land, but it's a land that never experienced the fall, and so there's a naivete to them that kind of boggles Ransom, but at the same time endears him to them. Yeah, and he realizes that even though they are the other, they're not the oppositional other.
Right. He learns to appreciate their beauty and other stuff. Yeah,
and we really see that come to light when he actually goes to Paralandra itself, which we know as Venus,
and doesn't go there by a science fiction route. There's like a crystal coffin that is sent to him, and takes him to Paralandra.
Very spiritual, very mythological.
Yeah. Now the other guy, who was the sort of pseudoscientist dude who was kind of hanging on the coattails of the scientist, he shows up also, and I can't remember how he gets there, but I kind of think Satan brings him.
Well, like I said, it's been like 10 years, but yeah, I do see it.
Well, and that's his thing, is that he's like, Ransom, I understand now. You were talking about spirit.
Oh, yes,
and all this other stuff.
And it was the guy that came back in that hideous strength. He was the one that was involved in the secret societies, and basically I see him as like the Hillary Clinton of today. He was that guy that was.
I don't think he comes back in hideous strength because Ransom kills him on Venus.
Okay,
he throttles him dead as a spoiler, but it's not. But to be fair, he was already dead. Satan goes into this guy because he's no longer a pseudoscientist. He's like a mystical pantheist of some kind. And he's like, I open myself to spirit. Let it do with me as you will. And he's immediately struck dead by Satan. And then Satan starts to go.
And that's where I got kind of mixed up, is that we see that same exact thing happening.
Is he the head in hideous strength? Is he the head? I can't remember.
It's been so long. It really
they have a head.
The
head of the organization.
The guy that abducted him was the one that you're talking about. Okay, the guy that abducted him, I remember that.
He basically becomes the Antichrist beast.
Basically, give himself Venus over to the demon. Yeah. And but when he came back, it was like they were trying to sterilize all of civilization. That was their goal. Is they wanted to basically bleach everything. You know, I remember that speech, and it was very C.S. Lewis. It was very hearkening back to the abolition of man, about how we only regard things as dirty once life touches it.
It's technically the same character. The head is technically the same character, but I don't think it's actually the guy who died on Venus.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right.
But it's the macrobe. Okay, it's Satan. He's taken over. They've gotten him to. He's using the head to talk.
That's the implicit under theme of everything that he doesn't really come right out and say, but that's the idea, is that hideous strength is that drive to that kind of I keep wanting to use the word perfection, but it's a kind of perfection that precludes anything that is actually really genuinely perfect. It's a sterile perfection. It's a lifeless perfection.
Reminds me that the BBC crew who originally made Doctor Who were big fans of C.S. Lewis.
Oh yes, you can.
And I wonder if they would have, if you could ever stay. And like, so since we can't stage the space trilogy, let's just do something else.
My friend Jason, let me tell you this: I am one of the few people you will encounter that is a true Whovian. I am a Tom Baker fanboy till I die.
Well, Tom Baker was my doctor. Yeah.
I used to watch Doctor Who when I was a kid religiously. I would stay up till midnight to see it on PBS. It was my favorite sci-fi show. And to this day, when I'm especially upset and nothing else will comfort me, I pull up old episodes of Doctor Who.
I happen to have all the... I can't believe we're still alive. I happen to have all of the... I did that while you were drinking just to see if you'd spew beer out your nose. I happen to have all the episodes prior to Tom Baker. All the third Doctors, all the second Doctors, all the first Doctors.
Well, okay, you say you have all the episodes. I bet you a lot of them are storyboard reconstructions, because a lot of them are. Yeah.
Not for the third Doctor, but for the second and first. Yeah.
We just both outed ourselves as BitTorrent geeks.
No, I don't get them off BitTorrent. I get them off YouTube.
Oh, really? You ripped them?
Oh, yeah, Loose Cannon. Loose Cannon has them all on YouTube now.
Oh, I actually BitTorrented most of mine. I got like 60 gigs of Doctor Who.
Yeah, that's probably about right.
and that's the old school Doctor Who. That's not even including the 10 seasons of today, or 11 or whatever it is now. Which I haven't even caught up on the most current season. I do like the new Doctor Who, but it's not the same.
I kind of stopped watching after 11, who turned out to be number 13.
Well, Clara, the Impossible Girl. Were you following that?
I've only watched a few episodes of number 12, so Clara's still around. I know she's not going to be forever, but
it got way better.
I kind of figured it would.
I was really despondent for a couple of seasons because I thought they were getting super cheesy, super poppy, all that stuff. You know, catering to the modern ignorant audience and stuff, and the last 2-3 seasons were actually really spectacular. They drew it all together. They took all the meandering and made it make sense, and it ended up being epic as hell. And I think you'll really enjoy it. Good.
Yeah, I need to get back to watching that then. It's on most of the seasons for 12 are on Prime or
YouTube. Yeah,
maybe Netflix.
YouTube has most of them. I like the two most recent seasons. I think you have a hard time finding them in places other than Netflix. But Netflix and Hulu are great resources.
Right.
But so the meandering, we should probably bring it to a close.
And that's why you should fear the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell.
Because he's more powerful than the Doctor. He has the Doctor in the palm of his hand. But he doesn't because he gets the Daleks.
Well, next time we're going to be going into Sodom and Gomorrah. And Jesus doesn't say a whole lot about Sodom and Gomorrah, but what he does say is really interesting. And I'll probably will take that opportunity to look into some of the other things, including Jude. What Jude has to say about Sodom and Gomorrah, since that's typically that's one of those things that gets quoted sometimes that says, okay, well, universalism can't be true because Jude says this. Well, okay, we'll look at that.
And Jude's one of the ones who says going after strange flesh. I remember that.
And I'll look also at the verses in the Old Testament that talk about Sodom being saved after they've been slain. And being brought back to life.
A greater judgment on Jerusalem.
But they reconcile with Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Of course. I mean, it all comes full circle.
Yep. That's in Ezekiel. We'll be talking about that too, because Jesus is probably citing that actually when he's talking about how when Sodom and Gomorrah are rising up. But we'll get into the terminology and stuff involved, and we'll take a look at some of the other contexts nearby where those sayings are in Matthew and Luke. And
well, my appetite is sufficiently whet for that. I will tell you that. I am very, very eager to.
Oh, I was so surprised to find all the cool stuff when I started looking through this for this episode. Really there was
I'm surprised that we covered your material in less than 2 hours.
Yeah, we did. My material in less than 2 hours. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I struggle with trying to keep it relevant and not just following every ADHD, going every rabbit trail and stuff. But I think we were pretty concise this episode.
Also,
so
we need a shot of the kitten if you can find it, so our hits will.
Oh, wait!
Spike
bring me the kitten. I need the kitten. We need the kitten. Gotta get the kitten. We need the kitten.
Please.
She's not too happy today.
She's not wanting to share the kitten.
Give me the kitten. Give me the kitten. Give me the kitten. There's the kitten.
Oh, spike those hits.
she's hiding her domestic violence off camera.
Oh, okay.
This is the kitty. This is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
Oh, okay. I thought we were going with Anakin.
Well, I mean, he could be Lord Vader. I'll still call him that from time to time, but
that's okay. Cats can have multiple names.
Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I call him Henwad Long for short.
Henwad Long. Okay.
It's his Jedi name.
Ninja
Henwad Long. Ninja.
Oh, they're all good. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, this is so funny that you mentioned that. We were just at my dad's place earlier today, and he rescued a squirrel that now loves the shit out of him. And like my daughter was flipping out the whole time we were there. The squirrel's like running up and down my legs and stuff. He's not violent. I mean, it doesn't like to be held, but it does use people as trees. And so my daughter's all flipping out over the squirrel. It's like no one would ever believe.
I've heard flying squirrels make really good pets. Do y'all have any up there?
Sugar gliders. Some people have sugar gliders.
No, I mean wild out in the wild.
Oh no, that's south of the Mason-Dixon line. I'm pretty sure.
Okay. We have them around here. I've just never seen them. Because they come out at night. They're nocturnal.
I've never heard of them up here. I have heard of them down in like Kentucky, West Virginia, places like that. But I've never heard of them up here. I mean, we don't even really have any red squirrels. It's almost all gray squirrels up here.
We have white squirrels. We are.
Is that racist?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I guess in a way it is. We have squirrels.
White squirrels matter.
Dyer and Kenton, and mostly Kenton, but there are a few in Dyer, are some of the only places in the world where you can find albino squirrels.
Really? I imagine they must get picked off pretty easily by predators.
You would think, yeah. I imagine, yeah, but there's still some around. I've seen them in the past few years just on my own street. So they're spreading.
This guy actually loves to give me kisses. Give me kisses.
Oh, yes. Kitties are so cute.
Oh, he knows he's on camera.
Yeah, he's going to be shy now. What you need to do is tell him it's a computer, and then he'll like...
And walk all over the keyboard.
Yeah, walk all over the keyboard.
The cool thing is I am like the cat whisperer. I can make him talk. So you tell me, Henry, what do you think of the geopolitical situation in regards to Russia and Syria? I think
you should be the one who's
elect Trump. Elect Trump. Hillary equals World War III. Elect Trump. He's a little shit. That's all I'm going to torture him for tonight.
Okay.
He's my little buddy. He really
We should have led with a cat, though. We'll try to remember to do that next time.
Started off with either the cat or Adeline. Maybe both the cat and Adeline.
Yeah. I thought I saw Adeline there earlier, but we need to
lead
off.
I heard her for a second. She was whining, and I jumped up for a second. And
we need to lead off with the cat and with Adeline next week.
I hope you don't ever think that I'm not tracking the conversation if I like kill the camera and stuff. Because like you got to know, it's like there's just sometimes I can multitask and stuff, but I'm not trying to distract from anything.
No, I understand. That's good. All right, it's 7:30. It's time for me to go home.
Yep, time to bring the broadcast to a close. At least we gave the human perspective for the past half hour, and they know
Yeah,
we're not
the
just a bunch
human
of
and the kitty cat
robots.
perspective.
Well, that's the thing is that both Calvinists and Universalists end up coming across as robots because we have a very logical faith, as opposed to Arminians who have a very passionate faith. And I think you can have both logic and passion at the same time. However, as C.S. Lewis said,
The Arminian.
I think that C.S. Lewis was beyond both, but I hearken unto him when I say that we should have our emotions. How did he word it? The will can and must precede. No, the intellect can and must precede the emotion, and the will must precede both.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right. Yep, that's how that works.
I think there's deep wisdom to that, and the more we sort that out, the more we can actually see how each aspect of our experience informs us. But there needs to be a hierarchy. There needs to be a head, and that head is logical self-consistency, in my mind, anyway.
Mm-hmm. I agree. All right. Bye.
Thank you very much, Jason. I will. Well, of course, we'll talk a little bit afterwards, but for the rest of you, you're out. Peace.